meeting electronically by accessing the meeting live stream video at kitchener.ca/watch now. While in-person delegation requests are not feasible at this time, members of the public are invited to participate electronically in future meetings by contacting delegation@kitchener.ca to participate electronically or by submitting written comments. This is a formal public meeting to consider applications under the Planning Act. If a person or public body that would otherwise have an ability to appeal a decision of the City of Kitchener to the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal, but the person or public body does not make oral submissions at the public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Kitchener before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. We have two items for this meeting. Item 1 is Eden Oaks Trail. And then item 2 is the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw, Crosby 2.A. On item A, we'll get started first. Craig Dumart will make a presentation. But before we begin, I would note that written submissions on this matter has been received from Christine Small, Debbie Mayer, and Alex Chick. So Craig, if you want to make a delegation, or if you want to present.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you, sir. Before you are zoning bylaw amendments and a official plan amendment for 239 Eden Oak Trail. Next slide, please. The subject lands are located at 239 Eden Oak Trail, which are a vacant parcel of land identified as Block 214 in Stage 3 of the Green River Flats Plan of Subdivision. So that's 30T 10202. The subject site is approximately 333 meters wide, approximately 67 meters deep, with an overall area of 237 hectares, and has frontage along Fairway Road North, Eden Oak Trail, and 2 planned access connections along River Trail Avenue. So the subject lands are located in a mixed density residential neighborhood, which includes single detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, and street townhouse dwellings located directly to the north of the subject lands along River Trail Avenue. And to the west of the property is a 4-story multiple dwelling development and there's also single detached dwellings also located along Eden Oak Trail. So Rockway Holdings has made an application to the City of Kitchener for an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment proposing to change the designation on the lands at 239 Eden Oak from low-rise residential to medium-rise residential, and to change the zoning from R6 with site specifics to R8 with site specifics to allow the lands to be developed with multiple residential buildings with heights ranging from 4 to 5 stories. So it's important to note that concurrent zoning bylaw amendment and major modification to draft plan of subdivision 30T 10202, so that's for the Grand River Flats, stage 5 is currently under review, which proposes to transfer density approximately 100 units from that stage. So that's from stage 5 to the subject lands at 239 Eden Oak Trail, which essentially will result in the original number of units for the entire plan of subdivision not increasing. Next slide, please. So the lands are designated low-rise residential in the City of Kitchener's official plan and zoned residential 6 zone with site-specific regulation 1R, 596R, and 597R, and special use provision 419U. A minor variance for the subject land was approved in 2016 and remains in effect. So for the existing zoning permission, the R6 zone allows for multiple dwellings. The 596R permits a maximum building height of 12 meters, so that allows for 4-story buildings. And the 419U permits small-scale commercial uses. And the 2016 variances that were granted and remain in effect allow for the R6 zone density to increase to 0.88. They've reduced the required parking to 1.27 spaces per unit and reduced balcony setbacks to Fairway Road. Next slide, please. So when the initial application was submitted to the city for an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment, the development concept included 4 5-story buildings, 3 vehicular access, so that included 2 along River Trail Avenue and 1 access along Eden Oak Trail. And the development at this time included 352 residential units. Next slide, please. So after consultation with staff and the public, the applicant has amended the proposed design to respond to comments of staff and the public with respect to achieving a development with greater setbacks, reduced building heights, and reduced vehicular connections into the neighborhood. The vehicular connections along River Trail were then replaced by pedestrian connections, and the number of residential units was decreased from 352 to 276 units, and then building heights were reduced from five-story buildings to 2 4-story and 2 5-story. So next slide, please. So in summary, the revised development concept has decreased building heights from 4 5-stories to 2 4-story and 2 5-story buildings. The revised concept has decreased the number of residential units by 76 residential units, and the revised development concept has reduced vehicular access from 3 vehicular access points to 1 vehicular access point and replaced them with pedestrian connections. Next slide, please. The official plan amendment proposes to change the land use from low-rise residential to medium-rise residential. So both the low-rise residential land uses, both low-rise residential and the medium-rise residential allow for multiple dwellings. However, to permit 2 5-story buildings and increase the density, the official plan amendment is required. Next slide, please. The key differences between the existing zoning permissions on the property and the proposed development is really the location of the buildings. So the existing zoning permits 4-story multiple dwellings to be located 2.5 meters from the side yards. So in this case, that'd be meaning the building could be located 4 stories tall, 2.5 meters from the property lines along the properties on River Trail Avenue. While the proposed development is proposing to have buildings be located no closer than 25 meters from property. So that is a 10 times increase or 1,000% increase. Site-specific zoning regulations are also proposed to cap the building height at 18 meters and cap the floor space ratio at 1.5. So while the proposed multiple dwellings are 4 and 5 stories in height, the proposed height and FSR include an above structure parking. So underground parking on this site is not feasible as we need to protect the drinking water in the subject lands. And as such, an above grade parking structure is proposed to accommodate a portion of the on-site parking. The parking structure is proposed to be screened with dwellings along Fairway Road North, although it will still contribute to the FSR and the overall building height. So the parking structure itself represents about an FSR of 0.4, and again, a 1 height of the building itself. So the amount of floor space occupied by the multiple dwelling is about 1.1, which is really a slightly increase in density from the 2016 approved density of 0.88. And again, the structured parking adds about 1 floor of building height to each of the buildings. Next slide, please. So in summary, the proposed land use designation and zoning are appropriate and compatible for the neighborhood. The increased density is really a density swap between 2 stages in a plan of subdivision, and the overall number of units in the plan of subdivision remains the same. Site-specific regulations ensure buildings are no more than 5 stories in height and that buildings will be located away from adjacent low-rise residential properties. The proposed official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment demonstrates good planning principles, it's consistent with provincial policy statements, conforms to the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, regional official plan, and City of Kitchener official plan. Staff support the proposed amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for the thoroughness of the presentation and the report. Now we do have delegations. Our first one on this item is James McLean from Waterloo Region YIMBY. James, you have 5 minutes to make your presentation.
Thank you. I'm James with the Waterloo Region YIMBY group. I'd like to start by thanking Council for giving us the opportunity to speak in favor of this much needed development. We are a community grassroots movement that is here to support more housing supply and diversity in the Waterloo region, including Kitchener. Broadly speaking, we speak out against NIMBYism. NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, is a harmful perspective leading to new developments being delayed, reduced, or halted at a local level at the expense of the larger community. This is one of the leading factors in the housing shortage and increased wealth inequality in Ontario. The objections against this development are essential NIMBYism. Some of the comments that have been submitted are quite literally complaining about the how this would affect their view from their backyard. And while notifications were sent to residents within 120 meters of the site, I'm here to provide a renter's perspective. A renter's perspective is not always heard, but this is the perspective of the 276 people who would move into this area when it is built, and the 75 people who are unable to move in due to the compromises already made. I've spent the last 5 years, sorry, I hit a button there. I spent the last 5 years renting in the Kitchener area, and I'm painfully aware that we are facing a severe housing shortage. Vacancy rates for rental units are concerningly low, while rental rates are at an all-time high. The community desperately needs more housing like that being proposed. It's frustrating for me to see new developments like this have to compromise on the number of units when frankly, we need all we can get as soon as we can get them. And I wanted to address some of the objections that are raised to this development and why I think they're problematic. The often heard objection is that this may lower property value for nearby units and just a general resistance to change. And I'd like to point out that the city shouldn't see it as their role to protect an individual's investment at the expense of the community, that the city and bylaws are not there to protect premium lots or ensure high property values, and that the city has been open about growing its population and increasing densification, that provincial, regional, and city goals for densification are publicly available, and that anyone who is living here and buying property in the region can view them. And that the city frequently updates zoning to meet these requirements. In a city with high sustained growth, it is unreasonable for anyone to assume that they would be sheltered from the changes that come with growth. Regarding concerns over whether this development and this density fits into the neighborhood, I think when people talk about the character of the neighborhood, this is typically a way to prevent change at the expense of a larger community. We should not only consider how new this neighborhood is, but the fact that this is vacant space in a high growth city, not somewhere out in the country. Ontario is estimated to have a housing shortage of 200,000 rental units. Rent is at an all-time high relative to wages, and renters are typically in the lower income bracket and feel the squeeze the hardest. We know that increasing density is needed to create housing that is affordable for everyone, and this is a very modest density increase over the surrounding units. Regarding the traffic frustrations and frustrations over parking and enforcement, I think that's really misplaced. The staff report has shown that the parking is plenty for this style of housing. In addition, this is only 7 minutes from a nearby bus stop. You can reach the downtown core within 40 minutes, which is actually almost exactly the average commute time for people using public transit. And if there are concerns about transit infrastructure, we should invest more in that infrastructure. We shouldn't let it be an excuse to stop housing development. Many of the concerns raised also involve safety and providing an isolated environment for children. While I think those concerns were already addressed by the staff report, I think we need to think of where we expect these kids to be able to live where they grow up. According to Stats Canada, a third of people from ages 20 to 35 are living with their parents. An additional 26% have to live with roommates. And housing for all those ages and all incomes is required and is desperately needed. And as long as we continue to delay and restrict new developments, the supply shortage will only get worse.
James,
As the council's aware,
to wrap up.
Yep, almost every new development is facing resistance in the same manner. I would urge council to think of not just the current residents, but our future residents. Thank you for your time.
No, perfect. You're right at the end. Now, Jay, I don't see any questions from the committee, so thank you for coming forward. Your perspective is much appreciated. If I could just ask a question of staff, I would have preferred usually the proponent or proponent's representative typically presents a delegation after the staff report. On the chair's note, I don't see them as listed. I only see Mike Cortell for Explorers Walk and Christian Colidia as a delegation. Can staff specify if the proponent or proponent's representative is speaking today?
Through the chair, the proponent's representative has rescinded their delegation request. I do believe that they intend to request that the committee consider a referral to a later meeting. through the chair, I might suggest that we hear the remaining delegations and then return to staff so that Mr. Dumart might speak to the referral, the deferral request.
Okay, all right, that's great. Thank you for updating the committee. So again, we have two more delegations. Next up is Mike Cortell. Mike, thank you for coming forward. You have 5 minutes to make your presentation.
Good evening, Chair Singh, committee members, staff, and other members of the public. My name is Mike Cortell, and I'm presenting my opposing remarks to the development of 239 Eden Oak Trail. My presentation will talk about the following: zoning information, impacts to density, existing residential impacts, accountability and sustainability, outstanding questions, and I'll be concluding with a proposal to the City of Kitchener. There are a lot of parcels of land in the area that are zoned as R6, and no other developer was brazen enough to put in a building that would be so contrary to the established character of our existing neighborhoods and the surrounding area. With an R8 zoning, they at their own accord could go up to an 8-story building at 25 meters high without needing any community approval. We were told it would be townhomes, but worst case scenario, a product similar to the low-rise multi-dwelling units on Eden Oak Trail. And now that the market is inflated, we are going with a worse than worst case scenario and trying to now zone it on R8. We have used, sorry, could I get the next slide? So we have used GIS mapping to find other similar buildings within a 2.5 kilometer radius, and none could be located other than the ones that are currently existing on Eden Oak Trail. This is more evidence that the proposed buildings just do not belong in Explorers Walk. The number of units in the existing multi-dwelling Area B is approximately 80 units on 3.55 acres with a total of 170 possible parking spots. This includes garages, complex parking, and driveways. The ratio is about 2.1 parking spots per unit. Even with these huge parking allowances, Eden Oak Trail is still overflowing with cars parked on both sides of the street. The number of units proposed in the multi-dwelling in Area A is 304 units. There's 9 more brownstones per building on 5.63 acres. That puts us at about 205 parking spots with a ratio of 0.67. The new R8 zoning would be proposed at a ratio of 1.2. I challenge the city to show me a building in Kitchener that is not downtown where factors of 1.2 do not cause encroachment onto neighboring streets. Next slide, please. Transportation is a key factor when evaluating why we should not put any condo units at 239 Eden Oak Trail. Toyota employs about 8,000 people, and it would take about 3 transfers to get to 5 minutes away at Toyota from this location using public transportation. We're nowhere near grocery stores, amenities, or community centers, daycares to support this influx of people. Next slide, please. I'd like to draw your attention to the red arrow in this revised concept of the plan that was sent to us last meeting. The response we got about grading was that it doesn't really tell a full story. We were told that the backfill on the site wouldn't be that enormous because it just would take too much backfill. But the truth of the matter is they're planning to have the brownstones exit onto the Fairway Road sidewalk. So that poses the question on the right is a viewpoint of how much backfill would be needed. And so we're talking about possibly a 10-foot retaining wall. Next slide, please. The increase in density increases residents' house cars and premium. Higher population just increases electricity, storm, and garbage services, and it shoulders the costs onto the surrounding residents. We've been in this neighborhood for 5 years now. The construction is just constantly ongoing, and this would just prolong it. There's lot premiums to be concerned here as well. We've all played lot premiums, and I don't feel like it's a fact of not in my backyard NIMBYism, because I do believe that we paid the lot premiums and we are okay with certain things going up in that land, but we just don't want it to be massive so that the character of this overall development is squandered. The GRCA does not approve of the water balance and watershed of the current proposal, and I don't know how that affects 100-year storms and redesigning of stormwater ponds and such. Next slide, please. Minor variances are approved all the time and have an immense amount of authority, but that just brings me to the next slide on accountability. The city isn't responsible to changes in the plan and zoning provisions. The developer is free to use the land. We don't know at the end of the day if we all agree on something and then it comes to something being overturned, or because it's a giant rental complex, they have corporations that can really spearhead all the appeals that we've made in some of these preliminary meetings.
Mike, if you can begin to wrap up, please.
Yes, I understand. Buildings go bankrupt, they're unkept. We fear that the project might see issues like 141 Park Street or Trillium. As previously mentioned, all of the homeowners in the immediate area would be subject to the nuisance of the construction. Next slide, please. These are some outstanding questions that don't need to be reviewed, but you guys can take a look at them afterwards. The proposal to, next slide, please, sorry. The proposal to the city of Kitchener is to educate the designer and developer about Explorers Walk's character and aesthetic, restart the zoning process before R6 as no communication was provided to any of the residents in the area, reconsider the massive addition to density. We need daycares, after-school programs, and neighborhood engagement centers. Bring the GRCA into the next meeting to help answer some questions about erosion, water balance, and watershed, and just stop ongoing construction in the neighborhood as it's been 5 to 6 years and counting. And establish accountability for the things that we are agreeing on in this preliminary meeting. Thank you, Councillor and Chair, for allowing me the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Mike. And I gave you a little extra time, as I did for James as well. I don't see any questions from the committee. Once more, thank you for presenting. Next we have is Christiane Coldia.
Through the chair, there is no other delegations for this item.
Okay, all right. In that case, if staff want to give their comment on the applicant's request to defer the item for a later date. Mr. Reedman?
Through the chair, I believe the local councillor was copied as well, and we'll raise the deferral. I think that's more appropriate than staff, especially since planning staff are in support of the application right now.
Okay, I just wanted to get that comment from staff perspective on their request. I'll go to Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Chair Singh. Yes, given the situation here, I would like to raise the motion of deferral for this.
Okay, excellent. So I'll take that as your deferred motion. I have a couple committee members that have questions. Councillor Marsh.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm a little confused. Is there any light that you can shed on the reason for the deferral? Is it, or is it private? Councillor Schneider?
Councillor Schneider, go ahead if you want to just add some more context.
Sure. I believe that there is an imminent sale of this property, and
okay, sorry, I didn't mean to. No. It was just a little bit of a shock that. So that's fine. All right. Councillor Singh, I will have questions of staff based on some of the delegates' comments, but perhaps we, at your discretion, maybe we'll wait until we see this come forward again.
Yeah, so because again, if a defer motion is being put forward, there may be some revision or change to what's being requested. So that could change. Obviously, we've heard from the delegates. We know some of the concerns that they laid in support or in opposition. If you take note of your questions and if you see the application not changing much, you can bring those questions. I would advise it would be more prudent to bring it up when this item comes back. Thank you. Councillor Davey.
Pardon me, Councillor Marsh already asked my question. I just was curious on the timing of the deferral.
Okay, excellent. So again, the item has been put forward by Councillor Schneider for it to be deferred. I did allow staff an opportunity to see if they saw any opposition to the request and of course the deferral motion. They don't see any issue with it either. Councillor Gazzola?
I just want to let you know that I can vote. My machine has caught the COVID, so I'm on a backup machine. So I can hear you and follow you, and I can vote, but you can't see me.
So when I call the vote, just raise your hand the way you did for meeting request.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much. And thank you to staff.
Sorry, Councillor Singh, my hand
yeah,
is up there.
Yeah.
Was there a timing on that?
Actually, no, there wasn't.
I would have to leave that up to staff because I'm not, I just learned of this like moments ago. So I would.
Monte, do you have any comment or Craig, do you have any idea so far when this would come back?
Through the chair to council, my understanding is that the applicant would like to try to come back for the June cycle. So staff will follow up with the applicant after tonight's meeting and see if we can achieve that time frame. Thank you. Okay.
Good. So if the committee has an understanding, it will likely come back in June, or again, if this item needs to be further dealt with, then it would be at a future date. So, and that can be managed by staff. So move on to item number 2, which is the new zoning bylaw, stage 2A. And before we begin, would note that written submissions on this matter has been received by Alex Vanderloos and Schlegel Urban Development on behalf of Schlegel Urban Development, and as well as from Hal Yeager. We do have a staff presentation by Tim Donagany, and it will be a 5-minute presentation. Tim, when you're ready, when you're able. Actually, before you begin, I just want to, for clarity, and I think this clarity will help me in being able to effectively chair as well. The item coming forward is a general amendment to our zoning bylaws. It doesn't speak to specific property, correct?
That's correct, Chair Singh.
And when either specific properties are if a change is designated from their current use, those individual properties would come at a later point to council.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Go on.
All right, thanks, Chair Singh and members of council. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about Crosby Stage 2A, which we're calling the residential base zones or residential zoning categories. Next slide, please. So to put this piece of work in perspective, this is the long life cycle of policy and implementation that's happened over the years. So Places to Grow, the first growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, set out some new directions in regional planning in 2006. That was updated in the regional official plan in 2009. City of Kitchener official plan went one step further in the details of those provincial directions in 2014. That was held at appeals at LPAT until 2009. But really the last piece of the puzzle in getting that that planning alignment happening is the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw we're working with today is from 1985. The residential component is circa 1994. So it's really imperative that we get moving on finalizing this piece of zoning work, which we're calling Crosby. And Crosby Stage 2A is a key piece in this puzzle to really move on finalizing the new zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So a bit of context. In April of 2019, Council approved Crosby Stage 1, and that was mostly the non-residential zones in the city, so commercial, mixed use, industrial, employment, those kinds of zones. There were about 3,300 properties out of the city's 70,000 or so properties. That was a lot of work. And then we came back to you in October of 2019 and introduced Crosby Stage 2A, which is the residential based zones or the zone categories. Because Stage 1 was under appeal at that time, Council endorsed the staff recommended bylaw for the residential based zones, but weren't in a position to actually pass the bylaw because Stage 1 was under appeal. And we thought those Stage 1 appeals would be resolved in relatively short order, but COVID came and that was not so. It took until December of 2020 for those appeals to be resolved on Stage 1, except for one site specific. So it's been 18 months since Council endorsed Crosby Stage 2A, the residential based zones. Given the amount of time that's passed since then, we thought it prudent to come back for another statutory public meeting, get Council's consideration, hear from other members of the community who maybe weren't plugged in 18 months ago. So that's where we are today in Crosby Stage 2A. We're seeking to add these new residential zone categories or residential based zones to the new zoning bylaw, which is Crosby. Next slide, please. So as Chair Singh mentioned at the outset, Crosby Stage 2A or the zone category sets the residential zones from Res 1 to Res 7. It collapses the original or the 9 zone categories in the current bylaw 85-1 into 7 categories, permitting different uses like single detached apartments, townhouses. It also sets height, setback, floor space ratio. Those kinds of regulations are all included in the zone categories, as well as some general regulations, say about parking width, ADUs, that sort of thing. But what Crosby Stage 2A is not about is applying those zones to other properties. So it's those base zones that are going to be applied to properties through other projects. And we'll talk a bit later about what those other projects are, but Stage 2A really sets the stage to allow us to complete that zoning bylaw. So once the zone categories are established, the zones are applied to properties through other projects, we can really get to enabling the kind of city building that we want to see and that we've outlined in our official plan and move it towards implementation. Next slide. So we talked a lot about the drivers and key issues in Stage 2A of Crosby in October of 2019. I won't talk about them in as much detail as I did then, but at a high level, we're implementing the urban design manual, key directions, the official plan, and the residential intensification and established neighborhood study of 2017. Next slide. It's about residential zones. So obviously affordability is a key consideration. It was in 2019, even more so now. Zoning cannot ensure affordability, but there's some things we can do to provide for opportunities for affordability. So Kitchener is rather unique in that it does permit a broad range of housing types in a lot of zones. Kitchener is ahead of the trend in that way. Crosby residential based zones carry on that trend. Permit all sorts of housing types from backyard homes to apartments, single detached, and additional dwelling units is a big move that we talked about at the last meeting of council and that you approved. Next slide. So the bylaw that's before you tonight is very much the same as the one as you endorsed in October of 2019. The key change really is to mirror some tweaks to the additional dwelling units to reflect what was approved at the last council meeting in April. So they really reflect the ADU, additional dwelling unit permissions that were approved last month for 85-1. One thing that's different is that it would add the potential to have 2 additional dwelling units within a main building. That was not included in the bylaw from last month. Next slide, please. I said Rienz was a key driver. So some of the Rienz setback regulations were established in bylaw 85.1 and projecting garages. Those are largely carried forward with some refinements. As well, bylaw 85.1 didn't address Rien's recommendation about setting maximum building height between two bungalows. So Crosby Stage 2A does add in circumstances in established neighborhoods where lots are bounded on both sides by bungalows, establish a 9-meter height cap to try and stay more in character with low-rise neighborhoods. Next slide. Another key item that came up and that staff received direction from council about as part of stage 1 was to address transition from medium and high-rise development to low-rise development. So there's a bunch of ways that we can achieve transition. Geographic implementation of the zone, so making sure if we can avoid a high-rise and low-rise residential don't abut each other. There are ways we can deal with in site-specific provisions. We can buffer them with schools and roadways, but also there's a general provision within the bylaw that says within 12 meters, within 15 meters of a low-rise property, no building can be more than 12 meters high. So it sort of provides for this sort of 2-block form in transition from low to high-rise residential. So that's a general provision that was there in October of 2019, and we're recommending carrying forward. Next slide. So what about community engagement? We did pretty robust community engagement since 2019 on this, and really since the kickoff of the Crosby project back in 2015. A key piece that we did in 2019 was an online survey that addressed some of the key challenges around transition, about additional dwelling units and driveway widths. We had about 350 or so participants in that online survey, so we're pleased by that. Had a public meeting of council, 50 or so back and forth comments, 15 comments back in 2017. Worked quite closely with the Waterloo Region Home Builders Association, Crosby liaison committee, so I had pretty robust engagement. This meeting again today has brought a few more comments forward, which have been helpful. And the topics that we heard about were really about affordability, backyard homes, character, garages and driveways, consideration for large buildings and smaller lots, transition and lodging houses. So those issues I think we've addressed well in the bylaw. Staff are in a position, I think, to make a recommendation that these new residential base zones be applied. And we can make tweaks to those as we move forward in subsequent projects. Next slide, please. So once we have these new residential base zones applied or added to the bylaw, how are we going to apply them to properties? Well, there's a bunch of projects on the go. So council will know about the neighborhood planning review, the central neighborhood secondary plans that are under review. You'll get an update from staff on the timing of that project next month in June. We also need to apply new zoning and new official plan policies in other station areas around Fairway, Blockline, and Sports World stations. So that work will be kicking off this year. We have secondary plans happening in Hidden Valley, in Lower Dune, and those projects will also use the new residential base zones. And then through the bulk of the city or the rest of the city, low rise, mid rise, and high rise residential areas, we're talking about moving into Crosby Stage 2B, which will apply the new residential base zones to approximately 50,000 residential properties. Doing engagement this spring, summer, and fall, and the intent is that we bring forward a bylaw for council's consideration and a statutory public meeting at the end of the month, or at the end of the year, I'm sorry. So those are some of the projects that will work together using the new residential base zones in 2A, get them applied geographically through the vast majority of the city, and hopefully get the Crosby project finished or nearly finished in the next couple of years. Well, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Councillor Michaud, it shows that you have a question. If you have a question of process, go ahead. Otherwise, if you can just hold your question, we have other delegations and we'll come back to you again for questions of staff. Excellent.
Should I take my hand down? I can wait.
Yes.
Okay.
just helps reduce the work for me. So
Sure.
next we have delegation, which is Alex Vanderlewis with Schlegel Urban Development. Welcome, Alex. You have 5 minutes to make your presentation.
Thank you, Chair Singh, Mayor Verbanovic, and members of committee. My name is Alex Vandersluis, and I'm appearing this evening on behalf of Schlegel Urban Developments. First off, my notes are gone. First off, I want to thank staff for their work on this bylaw. It's a significant undertaking, and Schlegel is pleased to again be contributing to this Crosby process. We submitted a brief letter at the end of last week speaking to a few items, and I wanted to make myself available in case there were any questions with respect to our letter, and to add a bit of commentary on one of the more technical items. We've got a graphic on screen that I'm going to walk through in a second here. So our request is to include street townhouses and cluster townhouses in an exemption within the definition for building height, that they not be subject to a regulation that controls the height of a building to 110% of the maximum height all the way around a building. And so the way the building height definition works is you take your highest point of grade surrounding a building, and you take the highest point of the building, and you calculate between those two points, and you get your building height. And for all uses except single detached dwellings right now, or I should say as proposed, as you move around that building, you can only vary by up to 10%. So the highest and lowest points of grade around the building can't vary by more than 10%, or else you'll exceed the maximum building height calculation. So the graphic on screen here is from a block of proposed townhomes at our Wollaston development. As you can see, the units terrace downward from left to right because there is a crossfall grade on the street. The units also have walkout conditions at the back of the unit. So although it presents at the street as a typical two-story building, on the other side of the building, there is a third visible story in the backyard as a sort of typical walkout condition. And so whereas a single detached dwelling, you see walkout units all the time, because they're not subject to this, I'll call it the 110% regulation. A street townhouse would not comply with the regulation as written, because it's sort of a compound issue here where you're falling across the building. The building is also longer than a single detached home. And so there's sort of the crossfall is exaggerated. And then it can be compounded if you have a walkout unit or a deck lot unit where your lowest point on your building might be varying significantly around the building, even though, as it addresses the street, it's, essentially what you would expect to see from the street and from a regulation that controls building height and built form. So our request today is to include street townhomes and cluster townhomes in the exemption that single detached dwellings are currently proposed to enjoy, in not having to meet or be constrained by this 110% maximum height regulation. Really, that's all I have to say. I think staff did a great job. This is going to be an important document, as Tim mentioned, in implementing some significant pieces of policy. And I'm here for any questions that committee may have of me.
Thank you, Alex. Just as a summary, so we have it better understood. So you're essentially asking for cluster homes, street fronting, for them to be, their height to be measured as same as single residential homes with varying heights on their lot.
Yes, yeah. The proposed bylaw is it gets much more granular in defining different types of townhomes, which in itself is a really good improvement over the previous bylaw. But essentially, as you've stated, Chair Singh, that street townhomes and cluster townhomes, which are two types of defined uses within the proposed bylaw, be categorized similar to single detached dwellings and not having to meet that 110% regulation.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Councillor Marsh. Go ahead, Councillor Marsh.
Thank you, Alex, for coming in. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are. You know, let's say one of those bungalows was next door to a cluster townhouse, and it was lower down on the hill. Wouldn't what you're proposing then really just make it even more of a dramatic difference? And how would you propose to address that type of thing?
So, you know, it's an interesting question. As you work through a zoning bylaw, you kind of have to come up with a lot of these different scenarios to sort of test your regulations.
Yeah.
So I guess, you know, if it were acceptable to build a single detached home under the same conditions, I'd be curious as to why there would be more constraint put upon a street townhouse dwelling that from the street would prevent very similar, you know, you see 2 stories from the street, likely an attached garage. However, it would have the benefit of being a slightly more dense built form than single detached homes would allow for.
Mm-hmm. I can understand where you're coming from. I guess staff would have their answer for that. They're the subject matter experts here, but I would say that the crossfall, as you describe it, would not be as dramatic as it could be for a townhome development, right? And so for a single family home footprint would not be as potentially not likely to be so dramatic, but also the massing of it. You know, I understand your perspective, and I would hope that if it made sense in the context in which you're proposing this type of development, you know, certainly it can be done very well. Wouldn't you imagine that then a committee of adjustment application would be supported by staff if it made sense in the existing context surrounding it?
Certainly, committee of adjustment can be an option, as our, you know, site-specific zoning amendments, as I think you're probably alluding to, that this might fit better as a site-specific regulation. You know, I see, we're seeing townhomes, street towns, stack towns, back-to-back towns, back-to-back stack towns. Like, they're coming in all these sorts of different forms now because there's, you know, sort of this upward pressure on land values and housing costs. And obviously there's a presentation before this that sort of spoke to both sides of that issue. I would believe, and I would say it's my position, that establishing it as sort of as of right within the base zone might make the decision between, you know, different types of ground related housing. It might make that a little bit easier up front. Mm-hmm. And it may be, I'm sure it's not going to happen every time, but there may be a case where somebody proposes to build street towns, you know, under this new allowance, whereas they may not have considered it before, or because of an onerous, you know, sort of secondary process separate to the development application, it
Sure.
may have been seen as cumbersome.
I appreciate that, and I understand. You know, thank you for that. I'm not trying to, you know, totally push back. I'm just trying to understand your perspective, and yeah. But thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you, Councillor Marsh.
Thank you, Councillor Marsh. I don't see any other questions, so Mayor Gravenovic, go ahead.
Just one quick one, and thanks, Alex, for coming in tonight. My one question is, you know, when you're looking for it to be treated the same as a single residential, is part of the rationale that when, you know, things can really vary with townhomes depending on the site, and if there's a whole process that needs to be, you know, that an applicant needs to go through, it either impacts affordability or potentially starts impacting on the ability to do some of the, you know, enhanced design features and so on. Because at the end of the day, there's a financial model to these developments that needs to be met, and so those are some of the sacrifices that potentially are made if we can't sort of find some wording that's amenable in both circumstances?
Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. So I believe, I think you're absolutely right. I think all of these things, working in this industry, these processes sort of just become, input costs to an end product, which in this scenario is housing. There's obviously a lot of upward pressure on housing from even a materials perspective right now, with the cost of lumber and anybody who wants to build a deck or a new fence is, being hit in the face with that pricing, let alone people who are just trying to make that first jump into buying a house, let alone people that already have the house and are trying to upgrade it. So I think you're right that extra process or extra time delays, all of these things start to become impediments, or at least are seen as impediments by those who are looking to build housing or provide housing. So I would see this as an improvement to the proposed bylaw, which is, as I said, I believe it's an incredibly robust bylaw. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. And I think this might be a small improvement that would take it, one step further. And as you've said, perhaps in some cases, might make the difference on a project.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. Next, Councillor Ioannidis.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for coming in, and thanks for sharing your voice and your concerns. I guess my question would be, would setting the limit from 9 meters to, let's say, 10 meters, which was what was traditionally in most of the residential zones, make sense? Right?
I think you may have cut off at the end, Councillor Ioannidis. I think what you're asking is if just a standard, maybe just raise the minimum. Is that what you're saying, rather than change?
Yes.
So that would certainly be a benefit, because we're talking about fine margins here quite often when whether we can meet the 110% or not. Perhaps it's 6 of one, a half dozen of the other. Whether you raise the minimum and leave the 110%, or leave the minimum and were to remove the 110%. I guess I'd have to see something from staff there, or to review a draft bylaw to provide a comment on whether the specific regulation would satisfy what we're looking for, what we think might be beneficial. I'm sorry, I don't think I answered your question very well.
Okay, well, you sort of, and just with regards to that 9 meter and from to 10 meter, to me, and wouldn't it make it a lot more sense, because it would provide a lot more variety of roof lines and everything else, because not every development is exactly the same.
Yeah, no, I would agree. As you start to loosen the minimums, or I mean, obviously you can't go too far with it, but as you start to sort of loosen those minimum restrictions, you do allow for more perhaps creative solutions. What we're currently looking at is whether we can work within the bylaw by reducing the slopes on the roofs and bringing those heights down, but that also has an impact on what things look like inside the unit.
Okay, so you'd be supportive of a 10 meter change in from a 9 meter?
At the risk of speaking out of turn with respect to the company's position, I think I could support the idea of that, and would love to see what that might look like in a draft bylaw form from staff.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alex.
All right, thank you, Councillor Ioannidis. I don't see anyone else, so I'll quickly just ask a couple. Committee members have been thorough in your questions, and I think you've made your position quite clear. One of the points that was made earlier by Councillor Marsh about, well, why not just go through the Committee of Adjustment? This is the bylaw, and whatever tweaks need to be made. What type of pressure or added cost or timing does it involve to a project when quite a few tweaks need to be made, as opposed to having a better clarity on the zoning bylaw, knowing well in advance when you're entertaining a project?
Absolutely. So We at Schlegel Urban Developments generally are greenfield developers. So we're developing new communities and creating, new parcels out of one big piece of land that we start with. And for example, the graphic that these townhomes came from are for units that are scheduled for construction, a year and a half, 20 months from now. However, we can't actually go through the committee of adjustment for this block of townhomes until we are registered, which it means that our draft plan, has been through the approvals processes, and then we're bringing a stage forward with the land registry office and actually creating those parcels so that they can be sold. So committee of adjustment it can be a site-specific solution, but from a greenfield development perspective, because you can't go to committee of adjustment until the parcels are created, and we're working sort of so far ahead of that timeline, it almost isn't even an option to solve like a problem that, I've sort of brought here specifically tonight, an example from our Wollaston development. Committee of adjustment would mean if we waited for committee of adjustment before we made a decision, it would add from today at least 8 months, because we're planning to register at the end of this year, and then we would need to get in the queue for committee of adjustment. So it'd be an 8-month delay to where this would be at if we were to move forward under a proposed bylaw like I've described.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Alex. And that's all the questions.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Next up is Matthew Kerwin. Welcome, Matthew. You have 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Councillor Singh. And hello, everyone on the committee. First time person coming towards the committee and to discuss on this item. Wanted to voice my support to the proposed changes to the bylaw as they're written, specifically to note the changes for additional dwelling units. As a homeowner in the city of Kitchener, it is nice to see that there is some movement going forward on this, especially recently with the committee's approval of additional dwellings recently regarding having one additional dwelling on housing in the city. But as the staff noted earlier, this is still different than what is proposed in the final recommended bylaw. And my concern is regarding the timing of implementation of the bylaw, and specifically the timing of implementation for wards 9 and 10, which are downtown wards and likely to have the greatest impact in providing additional housing when it comes to additional dwellings on residential lots. So I wanted to note that concern and was hoping to get some information from either committee or from staff as to what the schedule currently looks like for rollout into the different wards, and to why the downtown wards were placed at the end of that list.
So that's a question. Are you talking about additional units for backyard?
Yes, additional dwelling units on residential properties specifically.
Okay. I believe I didn't realize it was a restriction for the downtown wards, but I can open that for staff to answer back. Did you have anything more that you wanted to present? And then we can go back to staff for clarity.
No, that is the entirety of my presentation.
Tim?
Thank you, Chair Singh. So the decision that council made last month would amend bylaw 85-1, the existing zoning bylaw, to permit ADUs citywide subject to regulations. So we anticipate by the end of this month, folks should be able to apply for their scope site plan and their permits. In terms of the rollout of Crosby across the wards, you're no longer relying on Crosby in order to do an ADU. So it's everything else that comes along with Crosby. We're hoping the parts of wards 9 and 10 that are outside of the neighborhood planning review. So a lot of wards 9 and 10 are within the NPR project that Tina is leading. Will happen, and as you may know, they're waiting on some regional work to get completed. But the parts of wards 9 and 10 that are outside, we'll do an open house summer or fall of 2021 and seek to bring forward recommendations in a stat public meeting in the late fall of 2021 to consideration. So not as fast as maybe staff would have hoped, but it's certainly high up on our priority list to get the parts of 9 and 10 that are outside of the neighborhood planning review area done this year.
Tim, in summary, just for extra clarity for Matthew's perspective. So his concern was the delay in allowing for additional units, so backyard, tiny homes or coach homes. There is no necessary delay for that, for the downtown wards, correct?
That's correct. Should be end of this month.
End of this month. So Matthew, does that answer your question?
That does answer my question. Just to clarify though as well, is there not a distinction between what was recently approved by committee and what is proposed in the new bylaw in terms of building heights and restrictions and sizing and location on lots for additional dwellings?
So those could be a little different. So what I do recommend, Matthew, that you, if you can reach out to Tim, I think you probably have some more questions specific to your property. From staff's answer, it doesn't seem like it necessarily does limit you in proceeding sooner than later. But if you want more specifics of how the changes affect you and what you could build on your property, which wouldn't be in a general sense of what we're talking about tonight, that probably help you along a little more. So if you want to contact planning staff directly or Tim, I'm sure Tim would love to help you further. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't see any questions from the committee. Thank you for presenting. Next up, we have Steve Burrows.
Hello.
Hi,
Sorry,
Steve.
can't see anything. Hi. Okay, thanks for having me.
Steve, before you begin, if you can just give me a second. I got to do a bathroom break. Councillor Marsh, if you can just take over. Thank you.
You know me too well, eh?
Steve, you go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple general points I have overall in terms of concerns is the process and notification of residents. And this is brought up earlier by somebody that felt that they weren't notified that changes are being made. And I think something of this magnitude, I don't get the impression that people really know this is coming. That's a concern. The other concern overall I have is that it's being presented without the map to show where these are going. I think Councillor Marsh had a great question earlier with the 3-story versus the 2-story and the heights relative to, say, a neighboring building. And we don't know that condition even exists. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but people don't know. The other general points I have is I don't see a definition for lodging and boarding houses, and I don't see a definition for duplexes. I've come across that a couple of times where just understanding what actually constitutes a duplex or not is a difficulty. Another general point in terms of parking, and I think in some respects the parking that it sounds like it was already approved. I thought it was still under appeal. Is slightly discriminatory. When we're looking at limiting parking for, say, multi-dwelling units in terms of duplexes or boarding houses, and saying that you can only have one per however many square meters, it's limiting people's access to vehicles and limiting people's ability to live in, say, shared accommodation and whatnot if they do need a car. So I think that's something that we might want to look at. More specific questions I have is the 3 or more dwelling units, or the multiple dwelling units, and how does that work in terms of the 2 additional dwelling units? Because if a multiple is 3 or more, and you then have 2 additional, does that then become a multiple dwelling unit? And is that going to be permitted in residential, say 1 to 5, res 1 to 5 zones? Can stacked townhouses be considered street townhouses, because that's another one that wasn't included in the description. The other question I have in say 4.12.1, one additional dwelling unit, shall be in sentence B says shall be connected to municipal services. Does that just mean through the house or direct to the street? Is a question there, and that's general through all of these. And when you're looking at 4.12.2, 2 additional dwelling units, a minimum lot area of 395 square meters. Again, why are we placing a minimum there? You know, somebody's just mentioning that they live downtown in one of the core areas, and it's very possible that they don't have a property that's going to fit that. And already we have somebody wanting to do it and it may not fit, and they may not know it fits. And same thing goes for minimum lot widths. You know, if you're able to fit the building and meet say the landscape requirements and maximum area requirements, why would you not then be able to do this on a property with, you know, a width not as much as 13 square meters? And then G, so still under 4.12.2, sentence G, 2 additional dwelling units shall only be permitted in existing buildings. First is why is that, and then from when? Is that from a certain date, say creation of this bylaw, or, you know, can you build a building in the next week, put 2 additional units in it? Is there building floor area? So in 4.12.3, G, building floor area, I think we need a definition of how that works. Is that, you know, going to include people's basements and their attics and everything, or is it just ground, second floor? Is there how is that going to be defined? In 4.12.3, L, the maximum heights. It's not really quite clear how that works, and you know, specifically in terms of a flat roof relative to a pitched roof. Presumably, pitched roofs can become much more dominant than flat roofs, and that may be in an effort to encourage more pitched roofs and flat roofs. I'm not sure. And then when you get to M, for the shed roof, and you know, it's actually stipulating what direction a shed roof must face, and I'm not sure I'm clear on why that might be. And then stipulating that it has to be 4.5 meters away from property lines, which may make it impossible to do in some instances.
Okay. Okay, Steve, so if you want to just wrap up your comments, you've got a lot of good specific.
I've got a lot of comments. I think I'm almost through, actually. The transition one that came up earlier, I think, is an important one, and it's one that I'm not sure how that is being reflected. You know, how do you get to, you know, 50 meters away, not exceeding 12 meters until you're 15 meters away? This is section 419. I'm just not sure how that actually applies, and I think I'd like to see, you know, what the scenario is that brings that about, because it may make some properties undevelopable, you know, where you start, if your lots are only so deep, and once you start pushing both ways from front yards and rear yards, and you may get up to a point where you don't have a building that you can fit on the property. I can just leave it there.
Thank you, Councilor March. Jump in, take over.
Welcome back. Yeah, I'm glad you can take over. I just want to before I just hand it back to you, Councilor Singh, I just want to ask Mr. Burrows, have you had a chance to reach out to staff as yet to address these many specific concerns?
I only found out about this meeting last week.
Okay.
You know,
that's fine. Look, you have a lot of really good points to bring up, and what I encourage you to do is before I don't think we can go through all of those specific questions right now, but I think and Councillor Singh, Chair Singh, that's up to you, but I would suggest that we try to get staff and Mr. Burrows a meeting in the next couple of days and make sure that all of his concerns are answered. Does that work?
Thank you, Councillor Marsh. I was going to suggest the same. Mr. Burrows, obviously, as you're pretty familiar with the process, this is a first review through committee. The final decision is not made tonight.
It's a second review.
Sorry?
I think it's the second. There's one in August, I think. I missed.
No, I'm talking about for the bylaw, for the endorsement of this bylaw. It goes to the committee and then goes to council. So you will still have an opportunity before council, before this is endorsed by council and ratified. So what I was going to say was you do have quite a few questions, and I think you raised some very good points. It'll just help you as well if you're able to connect with staff and have some of those questions answered. And I think it'll be beneficial for the committee if staff can, include a council or committee in the answer of those questions. So now that you raise them, we can finally see what the resolution of those answers are. So I would recommend you connect with him, and then obviously if you still have concerns and you want to bring some of those concerns further forward before this is endorsed by council, you're welcome to come back in the next meeting. Okay? Would that serve you well?
Sure.
Excellent. Councilor Marsh, you still have your hand up. Did you have anything else?
Yeah, sorry, just to provide Mr. Burrows with a bit of clarity now and anybody listening to the meeting, I just want to make sure that you understand that the question about lodging houses has been deferred to our affordable housing strategy process, and that has not been forgotten. That's coming. And then also you were asking about some depth. Well, that was my main one. And you were asking about where are these being applied? Well, the point is that these are base zones that are not yet applied anywhere. So there's no map because it's the citywide. I think you understand that, but I just want to make sure everybody understands who's might be listening.
I understand that. It's just you can't understand the implications.
Yeah,
it may be no concern whatsoever until all of a sudden you find out it's a Res 7 right next door. Or even if you're in a Res 7 and you can't afford to build a skyscraper or whatever building that's multi-res, you have a double wide lot in a Res 7. You just want to build a house next door. You actually can't through this bylaw.
Okay.
Right?
Well, actually,
back to my earlier point, rather than debating this now, I think it would be well for Steve to connect with staff and have those questions more in depth answered than what we can through this committee. And some of those answers can be shared with the committee, and it'll help inform us when we make the final decision on this. And once more, if Steve, you're not satisfied with all the answers of the resolution, I welcome you to come back as a delegation, and you can bring forward some more points that you want. Sure. Okay, excellent. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Burrows. I don't see anyone else, so that's it. Thank you very much. And that concludes all the registered delegations. Madam Clerk, was there anyone else after who registered late?
Through the chair, no, we have no other registrations.
Okay, in that case, I'll open up questions of staff. Councilor Michaud, you had your hand up before. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Tim. Thanks for the presentation. It was good and very interesting. I have a question though with regards to Lower Dune. Tim, if you could put the slide up again for me. Where you made mention with the Crosby zoning. Sorry, I'm not going to explain this right because it's not in front of me. You had Hidden Valley and Lower Dune as part of this process, and I don't see anywhere in the report that was given to us this week that Lower Dune is not included in this until the secondary plan is finished.
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh, if the clerk would like to pull up slide 11, that may be what Councilor Michaud is referring to, if that's helpful. Right, so as part of the secondary plan for Lower Dune, it will be applying new official plan land use designations as well as new zoning. So the new zoning that will get applied in Lower Dune will be the Crosby zone. So this is the base zone or the zone category that will then be available to be used in the Lower Dune secondary plan process.
But not until the secondary plan. It's going to coincide with that. My concern is that is this plan going to be laid out before the secondary plan is finished? Correct? I suspect it will be.
Yeah. So through you, Chair Singh, the base zones are tonight or next week, I should say. And then through a bunch of different projects, we'll be applying these new zones to specific properties. So these zones will be applied to Lower Dune through the Lower Dune secondary plan process, not before that.
Not before. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Michaud. Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, I have a few questions. I was looking at DSD 19252, the November 2019 report. And on page 18, it says, planning staff are proposing to add a policy to secondary plans to require land dedication rather than cash in lieu as a condition of site development. At what stage are we on in that? Like, is this something that should be carried over into the current Crosby proposal, or is it going to get lost, or where does it fit in?
Through you, Chair Singh, I'm not that familiar with that report, but I can tell you that the cash in lieu versus land decision is a decision that exists outside of a zoning bylaw. So the strategy about when to take land versus cash is a separate decision from zoning. They're not reliant on one another.
But if it were integrated into Crosby, would it not give the city the ability to?
Councillor Chapman, so it's not, again, the parkland dedication or cash in lieu, that's not incumbent on the zoning, the base zones. That's what we're discussing today.
Okay. The other question I had is
provision that staff are actually underway still looking at, and that will probably come very soon before committee and council for us to review.
Okay. Regarding the housing strategy, is there any reason why it couldn't be amended to this Crosby base zone document in such a way that it would be part of Crosby? Because I mean, it's, and yet it doesn't appear as an appendix or as an addition to 1951. Yet we refer to it throughout, right?
Councillor Chapman, are you saying, can we not look at the context of the base zones through the lens of affordable housing as well? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that as a baseline document, which is before us, would it not make sense to add an appendix that would include the housing strategy? Because that's not specific to any property.
That's a fair question.
It's sort of an addition to what's being presented to us here. Or at what point does it come to be an actual part of the zoning bylaws? Because it's referred to throughout.
Okay. Thank you for that clarity. Tim?
Through you, Chair Singh, a zoning bylaw implements the official plan primarily and other strategies, including the affordable housing strategy. So really it is a legal document that says what you can and cannot do on a specific piece of property, basically. The housing strategy has a slightly different purpose. It provides actions for the city to do, other stakeholders, other levels of government, coordination. It's not a legal document on the basis of which one could, issue a building permit or not. So they have slightly different purposes. The housing strategy is certainly important. Staff are working diligently at its implementation. It has some zoning implications, but lots of other zoning implications too. But to the specific question about an appendix to the zoning bylaw, it would be difficult to action the entire strategy as part of the zoning bylaw.
Okay. Another question I have is on page 112, 29B. I was wondering why we reduced the minimum. This is comparing it to the previous document. Why wasn't the minimum being reduced from 5% to 25% of parking spaces for electric vehicle parking spaces? Sorry, not to 25%, to 2.5%.
Through you, Matt, Mr. Chair, this 2A zoning bylaw doesn't propose to amend any of the parking or electrical vehicle parking requirements. I believe there were changes made to that at the late stages of Crosby Stage 1. I don't believe there's any changes to that proposed through this amendment.
Well, I'll leave it with you, but maybe you can tell me why it was reduced from 5 to 2.5%.
I don't recall exactly. I believe that was a council decision that was made relatively late in the game, in and around April 2019, but I wasn't there, so I don't recall all the specifics. I'm sorry.
Okay, another question I have is on page 123, where it talks about lodging houses, hospices, small residential builds, etc. I noticed in the previous document that we were working from and revising, there were sections that said reserved. So is there any reason why this one doesn't say reserved until we come up with the policy, and which might need to be broken down further and not categorize them all in one, but have lodging houses as one category and hospice maybe as another category. So I was just wondering, would it work better to put that on reserve until we could finish the process of coming up with what that might look like?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, there are some lodging houses that are currently permitted in non-residential zones. So if we were to take away lodging house regulations from, say, a mixed use zone that currently has a lodging house, it would have a zoning regulation void because bylaw 85.1 doesn't apply anymore. So for that reason, I think there continues to be value in keeping lodging houses in Crosby stage 1 as they exist, but also knowing that they need to be revised. We just wouldn't want to make that void of regulation unintentionally.
I have two very quick last questions, if I may.
Councillor Chapman, you are past your time, so if you don't mind, there are others that are waiting, so just keep back in. You'll have plenty of time with the second round. Councillor Johnston.
Yes, thank you, Chair Singh, and thank you, Mr. Donaghy. I know that you and your team have been working very hard coming up with all of this information. So thank you so much. So my question is for residents who are now who will be taking a really close look at this and trying to figure out what it actually means for them, for their neighborhoods, et cetera. And one of the things that I get asked from people is, and this kind of relates to a question that Alex had earlier, or a comment in terms of kind of doing something as of right, et cetera. But sometimes it's difficult for people to figure out when we put something in place, but when things can also change. And I know that that's kind of a difficult question to be asking, but I know that the people are trying to figure out, like, when we say that something is a particular zone or that it means this, but then it can be changed if they do that. And I'm just wondering if there's a way, and I think that Alex was trying to come up or talk about that in terms of making it as of right instead of having to go after variances. How do people know, I guess, really what they're dealing with? That's a difficult question.
Through you, Chair Singh, I think one of the pieces of work that's come out of the Development Services Review is trying to work on Planning 101, video explainers, really plain language on what planning is all about. And one of those key topics is, if we make plans, then why do we need to change them? And I think it is a good question that residents do ask a lot. And I think the answer is, when you're doing a citywide zoning bylaw that covers approximately 70,000 properties, you can't get all the context exactly right for every property. So that's a big part of it. But we're also working in a changing context, right? So the growth in our region is changing, pressures are changing, affordable housing needs are changing, markets are changing. So the Planning Act does provide for applicants to request changes and staff to consider those on merits to say, how do they align with our policies, our objectives, and our official plan, the kind of city that we're trying to make. Does it further those objectives or not? So that option remains on the table in a legislative way, but I think also it makes for good city building. So that's maybe too shiny of an answer. We understand that it's a communication challenge going forward, and we're making steps to try and do that communication better every day.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I think it's good that as staff, as councillors, that we realize that it's an issue and that we look at it in terms of how do we try and make that better or easier. So thank you so much.
Can't get it perfect, but we expect our staff to try. So no pressure, Tim. Next up, Councillor Marsh.
Thank you, Chair Singh. So yeah, I was curious about, in your presentation, you brought up the RIEN's recommendation to have a maximum height of 9 meters between two bungalows. But that, I was just a little, I want to ask you for clarification that we're not addressing that tonight, or are we?
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh. It is included in the Crosby 2A bylaw. So when Crosby 2A gets applied in the RIEN's area, so the central neighborhoods and Vanier, yes, that will apply once these zones are applied geographically. So that zoning provision is in there. It says if both the adjacent properties are less than 6.5 meters in height, then the maximum building height, sort of that house in between, is 9 meters. So that can get you a modest 2-story, but not the kind of massing that, say, Alex was showing in that townhouse project.
Okay, so if we know that that's going to happen in the RIEN study geographical area, why wouldn't we just be able to apply that rule sooner than later?
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh, as part of RIEN's implementation, when the study came out in 2017, there were a few key items that were identified to be accelerated. That average setback provision and projecting garages. The decision on why those items were considered higher priority than others to be accelerated and put into 85-1, I'm afraid I don't have the background on.
Okay, that's fine. Now but it's something I will ask further about. So I do want to just ask you about those maximum building heights as well. So we're proposing that instead of 10.5 here in this bylaw for a regular a neighborhood where they have 2-story buildings, not bungalows.
11, Councillor Marsh, 11. Being proposed 11.
It's 11, sorry. Yeah, thank you. It's 11. Is that including the peak? Is that right at the top of the peak, or is that, do any of the rules exclude the peak?
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh, that 11 meters is measured to the peak of the roof.
To the peak, okay. And in other municipalities, the peak is not included in maximum heights. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that. Was that contemplated before?
Yeah, through you, there's a variety of ways that different municipalities measure roof height. Some of them measure midway up the pitch, some to the peak. Kitchener, to my knowledge, is always measured to the peak. There are pros and cons to both approaches. And that decision about how to measure building height, I believe, was established in Crosby Stage 1. So we didn't necessarily think about revising or reviewing that, but yeah, other options are possible and have merit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Marsh. Councillor Chapman, you've come in your second round, so I'll take an opportunity to ask my questions, and I have a number. I'll start off with carrying on the theme about the height as well. I have had the similar question about, why aren't we mirroring our neighboring municipalities who determine height in a similar way? Again, development doesn't happen exclusively in Kitchener, and that developer only develops in Kitchener. They're developing in other parts in our region as well. So we want to ensure that there's some level of consistency. The fact that Waterloo does calculate in their mid-pitch, is this a good opportunity for us to have better clarity and having some conformity and similarity with our neighboring municipalities as well, and determining maybe a change in calculating mid-pitch as opposed to the summit of the peak?
Thanks for your question, Chair Singh. I haven't given it a lot of thought, hadn't got that direction from council to make that change in direction. Like I say, it's possible. I guess one thing I'd want to know as we go through this piece of work is that it's been a long time since we started this road of policy conformity, and would really like to sort of get it done so we can unlock the next stages of the process. But we do have on our agenda always an annual update or a housekeeping update to the bylaw. So there are some small tweaks that we think warrant some consideration. Alex's comments are on how we measure building height. I mean, that's one item that's been amended in the annual housekeeping bylaw, 3 or 4 times in the last 6 or 7 years. So it's always subject to refinement and tweaks. That might be a good one to consider. But in terms of implementing the official plan and the 11 meter height cap for low-rise residential, and that I would suggest that was that policy is done on the basis of a measuring to the peak of a roof. So if we were to change that, it would probably require making some changes to the official plan, because I don't think we want to go. I don't think it would be council's will to go to 11 meters measured at mid pitch. That would be quite a lot of height for low-rise neighborhoods. Like I say, there are other ways to measure it. There are other ways to evaluate it. Both have merits, pros and cons. If it's council's will, we can go for it.
So, but it does provide for consistency. And the other question is, and I don't want to go too deep in this, I think what would be fair is, as a few have raised this already, and I think I'm the third councillor that's raising the question about the height, if before council meeting, if staff can have, some informed comment on this, or even if, a change can be looked at in looking at mid height of the pitch. Alternatively, I think the question comes in right now where issues like Alex has presented does provide some constraints, as well as, where through Rienz, where there are 2 bungalows and you're restricted to a 9 meter, the issue comes in at the same time when the aspect of affordability, and we are encouraging having multi-dwelling households, at least duplexing, and with basements, if there are basement unit, the extra height or some extra height allowance provides for more higher basement window height, which obviously for a living of standard perspective, it's definitely something that we need to be cognizant of. So those are the points I had wanted to make. But again, my comment would be if staff can have a better response and something that's as a council we can put mind to if there is a consideration of a change through the council meeting, as opposed to doing it now where staff may not be prepared to give a strong rationale towards one over the other, of either changing it from 9 to 10 in those limitations, or either just allowing for mid pitch. Rosa, you're turning your video on. Did you want to say something, or?
Thank you. Through the chair, I just wanted to add that this body of work has been underway for some time. And so my staff, as soon as we were made aware of these issues, we did begin looking at the concerns that have been raised tonight, and we will continue to do so. But recognizing that the council meeting is 1 week away, I just wanted to advise council that it may not be possible to bring forward solutions on some of these matters by next Monday. And so anything that we are not able to address by council next week, we will work to resolve with stage 2B, the remaining part of Crosby, which we are anticipating to complete by the end of this year. So either 2B, which we're targeting late 2021, or through the next housekeeping amendment would be the 2 mechanisms that we could address and make any additional tweaks or changes to some of the concerns that have been raised tonight.
Okay, that's helpful to have that there are some avenues, but again, depending on the the will of committee or council, I think, we can have that argument later. Councillor Chapman, I had some more questions, but I'll key myself back in, so I'll allow you to ask yours, and then I just have a couple more afterwards. Go ahead, Councillor Chapman.
Mine's just I wanted to be able to understand the pages 225 onward, where it has the different sections. And they were showing in the first document of 2019-01, but they don't show in this document. They're totally eliminated, except some of them have been added and some remain, but there are many, and I realize that some of them are in UGC zone, and maybe that's why they're not showing here. But I was just wondering, are those gone now, those specifications for in this document, or is it, I just want a clarification on what that means.
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh, page 225 is the UGC zones. You may recall at the time of passing Crosby Stage 1, the UGC zones were taken out of Crosby Stage 1, so they don't exist. That's the area where that reserved language is sitting, sort of a placeholder until we come up with a revised approach to zoning for the UGC. So that's why the reserve is there. It was never included as part of the final approval of Stage 1.
Okay, and then further on, like items 1 through 72 have been eliminated, 74 to 79 removed, 81 to 158. So I just wondered why they've been, like, will they be brought back in a revised form, or what are we to make of that?
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh, those were site-specific provisions that applied to the UGC zones. So because we didn't bring in the UGC zones, we didn't bring in the site specifics that applied in those UGCs either.
Okay, I thought some of them weren't UGC, but I mean, I understand the UGC ones, but I didn't realize they were all UGCs.
Through the chair, I can help clarify as well. So yes, some of them are not in the UGC. Many of those are special provisions approved through Stage 1 of Crosby. And as part of the agenda package, they were not included for conciseness, since those parts of the bylaw were previously approved.
Okay, thank you. That's all I wanted to know. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Councillor Chapman. So just I have a couple of questions myself. I'll just note my time so I'm not monopolizing too much. If we go to the base zones and looking at a big difference from what we've been doing for the last, I don't know, 25 plus years to what's being proposed now, is in a Res 3, where there's a divide between, going for a 9-meter front yard minimum lot width to a 1 up, which initially was, say, R4 to R3, which was from a 9 to a 13.7. Now we're proposing something in between, which is a 10.5. So my question to you is, and I want to reference this with a quick comment, is I hope we can all understand the enormity of what we're doing, that this will affect some 50,000 residential property owners, many of which, if not almost a vast majority or big chunk, are not planning professionals or don't have a good planning understanding of what these impacts may be to their property. For someone that has, as an example, is currently R4 and has a 50-foot lot, currently under R4 and with a 50-foot lot, they can, as of right, they can build a semi-detached if they choose to. But through the reclassification, would they be zoned down or would they stay consistent? I'm sure there are many properties like that that may be affected. So I wanted to ensure residents such as those will be protected.
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh, you may recall when council approved Crosby 2A or endorsed Crosby 2A in October, they withheld a decision, or you withheld a decision on lot width in the Res 3 zone. The concern being that the most comparable zone in 85-1 would be R4, and it bumped up from a 9 to a 10.5. So staff thought there was value in a little bit more granularity in the zones, not such a big jump. We see very little product today being built at 9 meters. Most is over that, and we don't see all that much being built at 13 meters. So to have a zone that represents the kind of main middle of residential development has value, we think. Also, we brought forward an analysis in, I believe, November of 2019 that talked about the change in permission for semi-detached would be, there wouldn't be one, because the semi-detached even though if the use is permitted as of right, say on 9 meters, they would need to meet the regulations in that zone. So
no,
as we go forward,
what I'm saying is in an R4, if they have a 50-foot lot, 50-meter width, they can do a semi. But if they reclassify to a Res 3, in which case for semi-detached, you require 9.3, you require a 60-foot lot. So there, as of right, would be diminished. They would not be able to build a semi-detached. Would a property owner like that would they be downzoned? That was my question.
Yeah, through you, we haven't applied the zoning to any properties yet. So that's to be determined through stage 2. But we took council's feedback on that away, and we'll apply that in the report back that we did in November of 2019 as we look at applying the residential zones and how.
The reason why I asked if that is the middle zone, the reason why I asked is that is the middle zone in between where I see the most disputes or resistance coming back from the property owners. As you've said, you're seeing more product being built more than the 9 meters. Is that what's being built in the Greenfield sites? Are you saying there's not a lot of 9 meter lots being built in the Greenfield sites right now?
Through you, Chair, saying, yeah, they tend to be nine and change on the smallest side. We see very little right at 9.
Okay, all right. So again, there will be a mechanism to ensure that certain lot value or lot ability to have some consistency of what they were able to build before would be considered as part of the assessment when individual property is being looked at.
Yeah, through you, Chair, saying downzoning when it's contemplated is in very serious consideration and rationale. So
okay. The other question I had was, we had a very fulsome conversation on tiny homes or coach homes, and the one aspect of that limitation is the amount of parking that's required, so 3 car. The minimum lot width is being decided at, I think, 13.7 for if someone wants to have a coach home, correct?
Sorry, 13.1 meters.
Oh, 13.1. Okay. So they would likely consist on a Res 3 and beyond. In those type of considerations, is there ability for someone to have a double car garage where they can go beyond the 0.6% so that they can meet that 3 car, 2 in the garage and perhaps 1 in the driveway or tandem? Is there flexibility or again, that's something that would have to be assessed through a minor variance application? The reason why I ask is now is an opportunity where we can allow some flexibility through the base zone as opposed to shifting a lot of, weight on applications to the Committee of Adjustment.
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh. So we actually developed that 13.1 meter regulation based on the magic formula of what it would take to do minimum setbacks in a double garage. That 13.1 is sort of that magic number that makes everything work.
Okay. All right. Well, hope we're right. Thank you. That's all my questions. I don't see anyone else. I'll look for someone to move the item. Moved by Councillor Ioannidis. Any comments? I'll quickly just make my own. As I said before, this is a tremendous body of work. Staff have been working on this for a long time, so I do want to compliment staff. It can't be easy trying to get something right that's going to affect so many residents. We haven't heard from many so far individually as members of council. Well, guess what? We will when the individual zones are applied to each particular property. And staff are doing their best to ensure that there is limited impact, and we're moving forward to meet our pressures for density. We're trying to meet our guidelines by provincial policy. We're trying to allow for flexibility of additional density that helps for overall affordable housing and towards an affordable housing crisis. So I think this is a tremendous step towards all of that. So we can't ensure to get everything right, but hoping that we, the base zones, I think, move our community forward for good infill development, as well as more clear expectations of what someone can develop on their property. So with that, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Gazzola, you have a question now? No, you're raising your hand. Okay. Your support? Yeah, I remember. Thank you. And with that, the item carries. Thank you very much. That concludes all the items for the committee. Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, I just have a question about the the next steps. So the neighborhood planning review is due out in June 2021. Will there be further public consultation on that, or do we go with the secondary plans that were proposed last year? And is that what where
Councilor Kevin, are you asking for the base zones of how they be applied to the individual properties?
No, I'm talking about the neighborhood planning review.
Okay, all right. Again, that's not before us as an item.
No, but I just want to know the process, and will there be public consultation on in the report we received, these things were listed as next steps. So I'm just wondering, is there any public consultation included in these next steps? So it is relevant, but I didn't want to interfere with the passing of the Crosby.
Okay, that's fine. And you were welcome to ask that if it's in the report. You're welcome to raise that and ask that question while the item was being discussed, but go ahead, Tim. I wasn't raising an issue about the relevance. I just wanted to make sure that we're not taking unnecessary time of the committee either. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, through you, Chair Singh. You'll get a report from planning staff next month on the timing of NPR, what all public engagement is happening, how we're proposing to stage it out, considering how the region's work is advancing. So you'll get a more fulsome answer on that next month. In terms of Crosby Stage 2B, we're doing a series of open houses over the spring, summer, and fall on a ward by ward basis. We've covered Ward 2 already pre-pandemic. The subsequent wards will go out this year, sort of during a pandemic and digital, but lots of engagement happening there, lots of engagement happening through the other parts plans, lots of engagement happening on Lower Dune and Hidden Valley. So yeah, stay tuned. There'll be lots more engagement to come as we apply these new zones geographically.
And what about the downtown zoning? It says spring 2021.
You'll get a report on that as well soon. I can let Ms. Bustamante tell you a little bit more.
And will there be further public consultation on that as well?
Rosa?
So through the chair, thank you, Councillor Chapman. Yes, the downtown zoning project is just getting organized right now, and we do hope to provide an update to council in the coming months on the project timing, scope, engagement, and overall approach to that work. So there will be more information forthcoming. As you may recall, downtown zoning is a special area because of the way that zoning has been applied there previously, and because it is located in the city's urban growth center. So that project will have its own timeline and its own components, but council will be getting an update on that very shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And once more, Councillor Chapman, I wasn't trying to stop you from asking a question, but when they are more so ward specific and outside the relevance of the item that we already voted on, right? So again, it's a question that could have been raised and asked for more clarity from staff, and I'm sure they would have raised it if it was citywide component to the rest of council as well. That's why I was just raising it beforehand. So can I get a mover to adjourn the Councillor Ignatius? All those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to staff. Stay safe. Take care.